The Wild West, a land of endless horizons, unpaved roads, and a fragile kind of order. Between outlaws, saloons, and gold seekers, one figure stood between chaos and civilization: the sheriff. But what was life really like for a sheriff in the untamed American frontier? Welcome, history enthusiasts. Today, we're stepping back in time to the untamed lands of the American frontier, where danger lurked around every corner, and the rule of law rested on the shoulders of courageous men and women known as sheriffs. In this video, we'll uncover the daily life, challenges, and legacy of these legendary lawmen. Theirs was a world of dust, gunpowder, and hard-earned justice. Join us as we explore the Wild West, where every decision could mean life or death, and where the stories of these sheriffs became the foundation of a nation's myth and history. Let's ride into the past together. The American frontier of the 19th century was a place of paradoxes. It was a land of opportunity and danger, freedom and lawlessness, hope and despair. The westward expansion after the Civil War opened vast stretches of untamed territory, where settlers, miners, ranchers, and traders pushed the boundaries of the known world. But with the promise of gold, fertile land, and new beginnings came a darker reality: violence, chaos, and the constant threat of lawlessness. In these early towns and settlements, life was raw, unforgiving, and unmediated by the structures of government and law that people in the eastern United States had long taken for granted. The frontier was not simply a geographical space, it was a psychological one. It represented both the allure of absolute freedom and the terror of absolute lawlessness. Here, human desires and fears clashed with the harsh realities of survival. Families built homesteads with their own hands, sometimes miles away from the nearest neighbor. Entrepreneurs sprang up overnight, opening saloons, general stores, and trading posts to service the influx of settlers. Railroads carved paths through mountains and deserts, and the promise of silver and gold lured prospectors with dreams of instant fortune. But for all its opportunities, the frontier lacked one crucial element: order. Crime was rampant, disputes were often settled with guns rather than courts, and towns had no standing police forces or judicial systems to mediate conflict. In these conditions, the role of a sheriff was not just important, it was essential for the survival of any community. Before the formal establishment of law enforcement, towns relied on informal systems of justice. Early settlers often took the law into their own hands, creating vigilante groups to deal with thieves, claim jumpers, or violent drunks. This kind of justice could be swift, brutal, and arbitrary, reflecting both the dangers of the frontier and the moral code of the community. Yet, as settlements grew, the need for an organized figure of authority became unavoidable. Sheriffs emerged as central figures who could mediate disputes, prevent violence, and enforce the fragile peace. They were elected or appointed by townspeople, but their authority often depended less on official legal codes than on their personal courage, judgment, and willingness to confront danger head-on. A sheriff's badge was a symbol of both power and vulnerability. It announced to the world that the wearer was responsible for upholding law and order, but it also made them a target for criminals, outlaws, and anyone who resented authority. In a landscape defined by vast distances, unpredictable weather, and scarce communication, sheriffs faced challenges that went far beyond the modern idea of policing. They patrolled empty plains and dusty streets, often alone, relying on keen observation, quick thinking, and sometimes sheer luck to prevent tragedy. Their duties were exhaustive and varied. They kept the peace during public gatherings, investigated thefts, broke up fights in saloons, pursued outlaws across treacherous terrain, and enforced laws that were sometimes vague, inconsistently applied, or entirely absent. The life of a sheriff was also defined by the unpredictability of human behavior. On one day, a sheriff might be called to mediate a minor argument over a property line. On the next, they could face a heavily armed gang intent on robbing a bank or taking over a town. Many sheriffs were ordinary men who became extraordinary through circumstance rather than ambition. Some had served in the military, where they learned discipline, marksmanship, and strategy. Others were ranchers, hunters, or traders who understood the terrain and local communities. Few sought the role for fame or fortune. The risks far outweighed the rewards. The pay was modest, often supplemented by additional work in the town or on a farm, and the physical and psychological toll was immense. Towns themselves were fragile ecosystems. They could emerge almost overnight near a gold strike, a railroad junction, or a strategic trading route, but they could just as easily vanish within months if the resources dried up or violence became unmanageable. This impermanence meant that sheriffs had to operate in communities that were constantly changing, with transient populations that included miners, cowboys, immigrants, and outlaws. Law enforcement in such towns required not only courage, but also diplomacy, as relationships between residents could determine whether a sheriff succeeded or failed. A single mistake arresting the wrong person, using excessive force, or failing to act could spark riots, vendettas, or even the destruction of the town itself. The challenges of frontier life were compounded by geography and technology. Communication was slow and unreliable. News traveled by telegraph only along established lines, and many towns were isolated for weeks or months at a time. Travel was arduous and dangerous. Sheriffs pursuing criminals had to ride for days across deserts, mountains, and rivers, often without maps, guides, or knowledge of what lay ahead. They faced not only human threats but also the harshness of the natural environment, extreme heat and cold, sudden storms, wild animals, and treacherous terrain. Every journey carried the risk of injury or death, and reinforcements were often impossible to summon. Despite these dangers, sheriffs were central to the mythology of the West. Their very presence symbolized the effort to impose order on a land defined by freedom and chaos. The newspapers of the time often glorified their deeds, turning confrontations with outlaws into sensational stories that spread across the country. Ballads and dime novels immortalized their courage, painting them as stalwart figures standing between civilization and savagery. In reality, their success depended as much on negotiation, intelligence, and patience as on guns or physical strength. Many conflicts were resolved quietly, without violence, through careful mediation and strategic decision-making. Yet the potential for violence was always present, and the shadow of danger loomed over every interaction. The lawlessness of the frontier was not simply a result of human nature, it was a product of the environment and the times. The expansion westward was driven by economic ambition and the belief in manifest destiny, but infrastructure and governance lagged behind settlement. Towns often sprang up faster than the government could establish courts, jails, or policing systems. In the absence of formal authority, disputes escalated rapidly. Claims to land, water, and resources were frequent sources of conflict. Miners quarreled over gold deposits, ranchers fought over grazing rights, and settlers clashed with Native American tribes defending their ancestral lands. Sheriffs were frequently caught in the middle, tasked with enforcing laws that were unevenly written, poorly defined, or culturally contested. Moreover, sheriffs operated within a social and political environment that was fragmented and often polarized. Towns were composed of diverse populations with conflicting interests, immigrants seeking new opportunities, veterans of the Civil War carrying old loyalties and grudges, and entrepreneurs looking to exploit the frontier for profit. Native American populations were increasingly marginalized and displaced, often leading to violent confrontations. Outlaws, whether lone bandits, gangs, or organized criminals, roamed freely, exploiting weaknesses in law enforcement and the isolation of frontier communities. Sheriffs had to navigate this complex social landscape, balancing the enforcement of law with the maintenance of fragile community cohesion. The emergence of the sheriff as a central figure in frontier towns was not merely functional, it was symbolic. They represented the attempt to civilize a land perceived as wild and untamed. Their authority was grounded in the community's recognition of their role as protector and mediator, rather than in formal institutions. Every badge, every gun, every patrol carried the weight of expectation and responsibility. The sheriff embodied the promise that even in a lawless land, there could be justice, order, and security, however tenuous. The risks faced by sheriffs were compounded by the fact that legal structures were uneven across different territories. Some areas had territorial governments with rudimentary legal codes, while others were virtually autonomous, leaving sheriffs to define and enforce justice according to local norms and practical necessity. In such a fluid legal environment, the line between law enforcement and vigilantism was often blurred. Sheriffs had to make judgment calls in moments of crisis, and their decisions could have lasting consequences for the community. Success depended on judgment, courage, and the ability to inspire respect and fear in equal measure. Despite the danger, many sheriffs thrived in their roles. They built reputations that extended beyond their towns, gaining recognition for bravery, fairness, and decisiveness. They cultivated networks of informants, allies, and deputies, creating an informal intelligence system to track criminal activity. They learned to anticipate threats, read human behavior, and navigate the social complexities of frontier life. Their ability to survive and maintain order relied not only on physical skill, but on psychological insight, resourcefulness, and resilience. Yet, the life of a frontier sheriff was often lonely and isolating. Trust was scarce, and friends could be enemies in disguise. Long hours of patrol, constant vigilance, and the stress of life or death decisions took a psychological toll. Many sheriffs experienced fear, doubt, and anxiety, emotions amplified by the constant exposure to danger. They faced the moral and emotional challenge of enforcing justice in a world where right and wrong were rarely clear-cut, and where violence was an ever-present possibility. The isolation of frontier towns, combined with the transient nature of their populations, created a sense of impermanence and uncertainty that shaped every aspect of a sheriff's life. The mythology of the Wild West often focuses on gunfights, duels, and legendary showdowns. In reality, however, the daily life of a sheriff was far more complex, mundane, and psychologically taxing. Most confrontations were not cinematic duels, but tense negotiations, careful surveillance, or strategic interventions designed to prevent violence before it erupted. Sheriffs had to rely on wit, authority, and presence of mind as much as on firepower. Their effectiveness was measured not only by their ability to apprehend criminals, but by their capacity to maintain order, ensure public safety, and uphold a sense of justice in a fragile and volatile environment. In this context, the sheriff's role extended beyond enforcement to leadership, diplomacy, and community building. They mediated disputes between neighbors, protected vulnerable populations, and worked to establish the legitimacy of law in a place where authority was often questioned. They became symbols of stability, order, and moral authority, shaping the social fabric of the towns they served. Their legacy was not only in the arrests they made or the criminals they captured, but in the communities they helped stabilize, the traditions they established, and the sense of order they imposed on an otherwise chaotic landscape. The frontier was a testing ground for human courage, judgment, and resilience. Sheriffs faced challenges that were unprecedented and unpredictable, and they responded with ingenuity, fortitude, and a profound sense of duty. Their lives were defined by uncertainty, their days marked by vigilance, and their nights often haunted by the knowledge that danger lurked in every shadow. Yet they persisted, embodying the ideals of justice and order in a world where both were scarce and precarious. Ultimately, the life of a frontier sheriff was a complex interplay of risk, responsibility, and resilience. They navigated a world shaped by rapid change, harsh environments, and human conflict. They confronted the paradoxes of freedom and lawlessness, hope and despair, and in doing so, they carved out a place for justice, however fragile, in the untamed American West. Their story is one of courage, endurance, and the relentless pursuit of order in a land defined by chaos, a story that continues to captivate our imagination and define the mythology of the Wild West. Life as a sheriff in the Wild West was anything but routine. Unlike the structured schedules and predictable responsibilities of modern law enforcement, a frontier sheriff's day was shaped by uncertainty, danger, and the unending demands of a community struggling to survive in a land defined by both opportunity and chaos. The frontier offered no guarantees, and a sheriff had to navigate a constantly shifting landscape of human conflict, environmental challenges, and moral dilemmas. Their daily lives were defined by patrols across miles of unforgiving terrain, the management of jails and court systems that were often improvised, and the constant vigilance required to anticipate threats before they erupted into violence. The day of a sheriff often began at dawn, though beginning was a flexible term on the frontier. Sheriffs were expected to be alert at all times, as danger could arrive at any hour, from a fugitive on horseback to a dispute erupting in a saloon. Morning duties typically involved inspecting the local jail, ensuring that prisoners were accounted for, and assessing any potential threats within the community. In many towns, jails were rudimentary structures, wooden cages, or small lockups that offered little security. It was the sheriff's responsibility to prevent escapes, manage conflicts among prisoners, and maintain some semblance of order in these volatile environments. The care of prisoners was a delicate task, as mistreatment could provoke public outrage, while neglect could result in riots or jailbreaks. After inspecting the jail, sheriffs often turned their attention to the town itself. They would meet with deputies, local business owners, and community leaders to gather information about disputes, suspicious activity, or potential criminal behavior. In towns with no permanent police force, sheriffs often relied on a network of deputies or temporary volunteers, sometimes called posses, to assist in enforcing the law. These deputies were usually ordinary townspeople, ranchers, miners, or merchants who volunteered to serve for a day or more during crises. Organizing and managing such groups required leadership, diplomacy, and careful judgment, as inexperienced deputies could easily escalate conflicts or make mistakes that endangered the entire town. Patrolling the town and its surrounding areas was another central aspect of a sheriff's daily life. Patrols could cover dusty streets, open plains, dense forests, or rugged mountains, depending on the location. Sheriffs had to remain alert to a wide range of dangers: armed outlaws, rustlers stealing livestock, miners disputing claims, and even natural hazards such as flash floods or sudden storms. Travel was rarely easy. sheriffs often rode for hours on horseback, navigating rough trails, treacherous terrain, and unpredictable weather conditions. Their ability to traverse these distances efficiently and safely was crucial, as a delayed response could allow crimes to escalate or fugitives to escape. One of the most complex aspects of a sheriff's work was managing disputes within the community. Conflicts over land, water rights, or livestock were common, and disagreements could escalate rapidly into violence. Sheriffs were expected to mediate these disputes, often using a combination of negotiation, authority, and, when necessary, intimidation. They had to weigh the facts, consider the reputations of those involved, and anticipate the potential consequences of any action. In many cases, the sheriff's judgment alone determined the outcome, as formal courts and legal procedures were limited or non-existent. A wise sheriff could prevent bloodshed and maintain social cohesion, while a poor decision could ignite feuds, grudges, and long-lasting conflicts that threatened the survival of the town. The sheriff's office also functioned as a center of administration and intelligence. Sheriffs kept records of criminal activity, monitored the movements of known outlaws, and maintained lists of wanted individuals. They gathered information through networks of informants, conversations with townspeople, and observations made during patrols. This intelligence was critical for preventing crimes before they occurred, tracking fugitives, and maintaining a sense of order in the town. The sheriff's ability to collect, interpret, and act upon this information often determined the success of law enforcement efforts in a region where formal institutions were limited. Handling crime on the frontier required flexibility and ingenuity. Many towns lacked dedicated courthouses or legal personnel, so sheriffs often acted as investigators, mediators, and prosecutors simultaneously. They were responsible for apprehending suspects, gathering evidence, and presenting cases to judges or community-led tribunals. In some instances, sheriffs had to make immediate decisions regarding punishment, ranging from fines and public humiliation to incarceration or even capital punishment. The weight of these responsibilities was immense, as the consequences of errors could be fatal, both for the sheriff and for the wider community. While dangerous confrontations with outlaws were part of the job, much of a sheriff's daily life involved routine but demanding tasks. They inspected businesses for adherence to regulations, enforced tax collection and property disputes, and supervised public works such as road maintenance or town planning. These responsibilities were essential for the functioning of the community, yet they were often overlooked in the romanticized accounts of gunfights and high-noon duels. The day-to-day labor of maintaining law and order required patience, endurance, and a deep understanding of human behavior. Sheriffs also had to navigate the delicate balance between authority and respect. In many frontier towns, personal relationships were crucial, and an overly harsh approach could provoke rebellion, while excessive leniency might encourage lawlessness. Successful sheriffs developed reputations for fairness, courage, and discernment, earning the trust and cooperation of townspeople. They became symbols of stability, figures whose presence alone could deter crime and maintain social cohesion. Their authority was not always derived from the law alone, but from their ability to command respect, instill confidence, and project strength in the face of danger. In addition to managing human conflicts, sheriffs often faced environmental and logistical challenges. Travel and communication in the frontier were difficult, reinforcements were rarely available, and resources were scarce. Sheriffs relied on horses, wagons, and the limited infrastructure of the time to carry out their duties. Supplies, ammunition, and food had to be carefully managed, as shortages could compromise their ability to respond to emergencies. The harsh conditions of the frontier, extreme temperatures, dust storms, and rugged terrain tested both physical stamina and mental resilience. A sheriff's survival often depended on resourcefulness, adaptability, and a thorough understanding of the land and its hazards. The unpredictability of frontier life meant that sheriffs were constantly on call. Emergencies could arise at any moment. A stagecoach robbery in progress, a barroom brawl turning deadly, a group of rustlers moving stolen cattle, or a fire threatening the town. Sheriffs had to respond quickly, assess the situation, and make decisions that could save lives or prevent widespread destruction. Their training and experience were often the only factors separating order from chaos, life from death. In this sense, the sheriff's role extended far beyond law enforcement. They were protectors, mediators, and leaders in an environment where uncertainty and danger were constants. Despite the immense demands of the job, sheriffs were often compensated poorly. Salaries were modest, and many sheriffs had to maintain other occupations to support themselves and their families. Some ran general stores, worked on ranches, or engaged in trade. This dual role added another layer of complexity to their daily lives, requiring them to balance the demands of law enforcement with economic survival. Financial limitations of the position also meant that sheriffs had to rely heavily on ingenuity, community support, and personal courage rather than institutional resources. The sheriff's day was also shaped by the constant threat of violence. Armed confrontations were a real and ever-present danger. While popular culture has often romanticized gunfights and duels, the reality was more complex and nuanced. Sheriffs relied on strategy, observation, and careful negotiation to prevent violent escalation whenever possible. They learned to read human behavior, anticipate threats, and diffuse tense situations before they erupted into bloodshed. Physical skill and marksmanship were important, but wisdom, patience, and psychological insight were equally crucial for survival and effectiveness. Sheriffs also had to maintain their own mental and emotional resilience. The stress of constant vigilance, the exposure to human suffering, and the moral dilemmas inherent in frontier law enforcement took a significant toll. Many sheriffs experienced loneliness, anxiety, and fatigue, compounded by the isolation of frontier towns and the transient nature of their populations. Developing coping mechanisms, building support networks, and cultivating personal discipline were essential for enduring the daily pressures of the role. In this sense, a sheriff's daily life was as much about internal strength and character as it was about external action and authority. The social and cultural dimensions of frontier life also shaped the sheriff's responsibilities. Towns were composed of diverse populations with varying backgrounds, beliefs, and interests. Immigrants, veterans, miners, ranchers, and traders coexisted in a fragile social ecosystem, often with conflicting priorities. Sheriffs had to navigate these complexities, balancing competing interests, mediating disputes, and enforcing laws in a way that maintained community cohesion. Their effectiveness depended not only on enforcement, but on their ability to understand, influence, and guide the social dynamics of the town. Ultimately, the daily life of a sheriff in the Wild West was a constant negotiation between order and chaos. It involved a delicate balance of courage, judgment, diplomacy, and endurance. Sheriffs were responsible for the safety, stability, and cohesion of communities in a world defined by unpredictability and danger. Their actions shaped the character of towns, influenced the course of events, and left a lasting legacy in the mythology of the American frontier. While tales of gunfights and legendary outlaws capture the imagination, the true measure of a sheriff's life lay in the daily, often invisible work of maintaining law and order in a land where neither was guaranteed. In the end, the sheriff was more than a lawman. They were a symbol of the human effort to impose justice on a world defined by freedom, danger, and unpredictability. Their daily life, though fraught with peril and complexity, exemplified the qualities of resilience, courage, and wisdom that were essential to survival on the frontier. Through their vigilance, their judgment, and their unwavering commitment to their communities, sheriffs created the foundation of order in the lawless expanse of the American West, leaving behind a legacy that continues to define the mythology and history of this legendary era. A sheriff's badge in the Wild West was more than a symbol of authority. It was a mark of responsibility, courage, and constant vigilance. But authority alone was often insufficient in a land defined by lawlessness, danger, and the unpredictability of human behavior. The sheriff's effectiveness depended not only on their leadership, wisdom, and judgment, but also on their mastery of the tools and weapons required to enforce law and maintain order. The frontier was a place where disputes could erupt into violence at any moment, where outlaws were well armed and cunning, and where a single mistake could cost lives. In this environment, understanding, carrying, and skillfully using the tools of the trade was not optional. It was essential for survival. The most iconic weapon associated with a frontier sheriff was, of course, the revolver. The Colt single-action army, often called the Peacemaker, became legendary not merely for its engineering, but for its association with the men who carried it. Introduced in 1873, this six-shot revolver was reliable, durable, and relatively easy to maintain, qualities that made it invaluable on the frontier. Sheriffs carried the revolver in a leather holster, positioned for quick access in the event of sudden confrontation. But wielding a firearm was not merely a matter of technique. It was also a psychological skill. Drawing too quickly could escalate a minor conflict into a deadly confrontation, while hesitation could cost the sheriff their life. Mastery of the revolver required hours of practice, steady nerves, and the ability to anticipate the intentions of others. While the revolver was versatile and portable, it was not always sufficient for every scenario. Sheriffs often carried rifles, most famously the Winchester lever-action rifle. These rifles offered greater range, firepower, and accuracy, making them ideal for pursuits across open terrain or confrontations with multiple adversaries. Rifles allowed sheriffs to defend towns from a distance, protect civilians, or engage outlaws who had the advantage of numbers or cover. The combination of revolver and rifle provided sheriffs with a flexible toolkit, capable of adapting to the varied and unpredictable threats of frontier life. In addition to firearms, sheriffs relied on a range of other tools and implements to enforce the law. Handcuffs, iron chains, and padlocks were used to restrain prisoners and maintain order in jails, which were often rudimentary wooden structures or even converted buildings. Keys, chains, and manacles were critical for security, as escapes were not uncommon and could destabilize an already fragile community. Whips, clubs, and other non-lethal implements were also employed to manage crowds, control animals, or intervene in disputes before violence escalated. A sheriff's toolkit reflected the dual nature of their role: protector and enforcer, mediator and warrior. Beyond the tangible tools, sheriffs also relied on techniques, strategies, and improvisation. They needed to read situations quickly, understand human behavior, and anticipate threats. Surveillance, intelligence gathering, and negotiation were as important as marksmanship. For example, a clever sheriff could use the terrain to their advantage, position deputies strategically, or create psychological deterrence to prevent violence. Understanding the patterns of local outlaws, the routines of townspeople, and the dynamics of transient populations allowed sheriffs to act decisively, often before conflict erupted. In many ways, these intangible skills were the most valuable tools in the sheriff's arsenal, determining the difference between success and disaster. Horses were another critical tool of the frontier sheriff. Mobility was essential in a vast, sparsely populated landscape, and a well-trained horse was as important as a reliable firearm. Sheriffs needed mounts capable of long-distance travel, rapid acceleration, and endurance across difficult terrain. They relied on horses for patrols, pursuits, and transporting prisoners. A sheriff's relationship with their horse could define the outcome of a dangerous situation. A steady, responsive mount could mean the difference between capturing a fugitive or facing a fatal confrontation. Horses also symbolized authority and presence, reinforcing the sheriff's role in the community. A mounted sheriff patrolling the town streets commanded attention and respect, projecting power without the need for immediate violence. The environment itself influenced the sheriff's choice and use of tools. Frontier towns were surrounded by deserts, mountains, forests, and rivers, each presenting unique challenges. Rifles and revolvers were essential for long-distance confrontations or ambushes, but sheriffs also had to carry supplies for survival: maps, food, water, medical kits, and tools for repairing equipment. They needed to navigate hostile terrain, track fugitives, and maintain communication with deputies or allied towns. Their toolkit extended beyond weapons to include the practical implements of survival in a world where law enforcement was inseparable from the natural environment. Sheriffs also faced the challenge of maintaining and adapting their tools. Firearms required regular cleaning, oiling, and inspection to function reliably. Ammunition had to be carefully stored and rationed, as resupply could be sporadic. Leather gear, holsters, belts, saddles, and straps needed maintenance to prevent failure during critical moments. Even a small malfunction could result in disaster, whether in a gunfight, a pursuit, or the defense of a town. This constant attention to equipment demanded diligence, knowledge, and discipline, further underscoring the comprehensive nature of a sheriff's responsibilities. The sheriff's toolkit also included elements of communication and intelligence. Bells, horns, and messengers were used to alert townspeople of danger or summon assistance. Informants within the community provided critical intelligence about criminal activity, potential threats, or the movements of outlaws. Sheriffs developed networks of contacts that extended beyond the immediate town, often coordinating with neighboring settlements or territorial authorities. The combination of physical tools, weapons, and information networks allowed sheriffs to exert influence and maintain order in a landscape where traditional institutions were limited or absent. Training and skill were crucial. Unlike modern law enforcement, there were few formal academies or standardized procedures in the 19th century frontier. Sheriffs learned through experience, mentorship, or previous service in the military or militia. They developed proficiency in firearms, horsemanship, survival skills, and negotiation through trial and error. Mistakes were costly, sometimes fatal, and success depended on both innate courage and disciplined practice. This combination of skill, judgment, and adaptability defined the professional competence of a frontier sheriff, allowing them to navigate a world where danger was constant and lawlessness pervasive. The sheriff's tools also served symbolic and psychological purposes. The sight of a badge, a holstered revolver, or a mounted sheriff could deter would-be criminals, reinforcing authority without immediate violence. Tools conveyed competence, preparedness, and the capacity for decisive action. A well-equipped sheriff projected confidence and control, reassuring the community and intimidating adversaries. In many instances, perception was as powerful as actual capability. The reputation of a sheriff could prevent crimes before they occurred, demonstrating that authority relied on both tangible tools and intangible presence. Despite the iconic image of the gun-toting lawmen, frontier sheriffs often prioritized strategy over confrontation. Firearms were a last resort, used only when negotiation, intimidation, or careful planning failed. The risks of gunfights were immense. An accidental discharge could harm bystanders, escalate conflicts, or trigger retaliatory violence. Wise sheriffs understood that restraint, intelligence, and tactical thinking were often more effective than sheer force. Their tools, therefore, were instruments of both power and prudence, enabling them to navigate a dangerous and morally complex environment. Sheriffs also had to contend with social and political pressures when using their tools. The use of force had to be justified, both to the community and to territorial or state authorities. Excessive violence could provoke public outrage, legal consequences, or loss of political support. Conversely, inadequate action could undermine the sheriff's authority and embolden criminals. Balancing these pressures required judgment, experience, and an understanding of both human nature and the legal framework. The tools of a sheriff were thus inseparable from their role as arbiter, protector, and symbol of justice. The legacy of these tools and weapons extends beyond their practical function. They became central to the mythology of the Wild West, immortalized in dime novels, newspapers, and later, film and television. The revolver, the rifle, the badge, and even the horse became emblematic of a unique form of law enforcement in a land defined by opportunity and danger. These tools were not merely instruments of violence. They were instruments of survival, authority, and the tenuous establishment of order in a lawless environment. They remind us that the sheriff's life was a constant negotiation between capability, courage, and responsibility. In essence, the tools and weapons of the frontier sheriff were a reflection of the complex demands of the job. They combined practicality, strategy, psychological influence, and symbolic authority. They enabled sheriffs to patrol vast and unpredictable landscapes, mediate conflicts, protect communities, and confront criminals in an era without formalized law enforcement structures. Mastery of these tools was essential for survival and effectiveness, and their careful use defined the professional identity of the frontier sheriff. Ultimately, understanding the tools of the sheriff allows us to grasp the broader reality of law enforcement on the frontier. Sheriffs were not merely armed figures chasing outlaws. They were skilled, resourceful, and adaptable leaders tasked with maintaining order in a complex, dangerous, and rapidly changing world. Their tools, both tangible and intangible, were extensions of their judgment, courage, and authority, enabling them to perform a role that was as demanding as it was essential. In the hands of a capable sheriff, these tools became instruments of justice, deterrence, and community stability, shaping the history and mythology of the American West. In the vast and often lawless landscape of the American frontier, the sheriff's role extended far beyond enforcing simple rules. They were the embodiment of justice itself, often serving simultaneously as investigator, mediator, prosecutor, and occasionally executioner. Frontier towns lacked the complex legal frameworks and institutional support systems that existed in the eastern United States, leaving sheriffs to improvise, adapt, and rely heavily on their judgment. The nature of justice in this environment was immediate, personal, and deeply intertwined with the survival of the community. The frontier was a place where disputes were inevitable. Land was claimed rapidly, and sometimes chaotically, with overlapping claims sparking bitter arguments among settlers, miners, and ranchers. Water rights were fiercely contested, especially in arid regions where access to streams and wells determined the livelihood of entire communities. Livestock theft was rampant, and in towns built on gold strikes or trade routes, thefts, swindles, and fraud were common. Sheriffs were expected to resolve these disputes in a manner that preserved both law and social cohesion, a delicate balance that required a nuanced understanding of human behavior and local customs. Legal infrastructure was minimal or non-existent in many areas. Courthouses were often makeshift structures, simple wooden buildings, or adapted rooms in saloons or trading posts. Judges, when present, were sometimes itinerant, traveling between towns to hear cases, while lawyers were rare. This lack of formal institutions meant that the sheriff's decisions carried extraordinary weight. A sheriff might investigate a theft, gather witnesses, and present evidence in a makeshift courtroom. They had to assess credibility, establish facts, and determine an appropriate course of action, all without the procedural safeguards of modern law. In some cases, sheriffs even delivered sentences themselves, ranging from fines and restitution to imprisonment, or, in extreme circumstances, execution. Public perception played a critical role in frontier justice. In small, isolated towns, the legitimacy of law enforcement depended as much on community support as on legal authority. Sheriffs needed the trust and cooperation of townspeople to maintain order. Harsh or unjust actions could provoke riots or lead citizens to take the law into their own hands, while excessive leniency could embolden criminals and undermine the sheriff's authority. Effective sheriffs walked a narrow line, balancing firmness with fairness, authority with diplomacy, and enforcement with mediation. Their ability to read the community, anticipate conflict, and act decisively was essential to the survival of the town. Frontier justice was often swift and unflinching. Delays could lead to chaos, and the practical realities of life on the edge of civilization demanded immediate action. A dispute over a land claim could escalate into violence within hours. A theft of livestock might spark a vendetta if not addressed quickly. Sheriffs often had to make rapid decisions with limited information, weighing the potential consequences for the community and the individuals involved. Their judgments were guided not only by the law, but by a combination of practical wisdom, moral judgment, and an acute awareness of human behavior. One of the most striking aspects of frontier justice was the prevalence of public punishment. Hangings, floggings, and other forms of corporal punishment were often conducted openly, serving as both retribution and deterrence. Public executions were not merely punitive. They were symbolic acts designed to reinforce the authority of the sheriff and the moral code of the community. These events drew crowds, sending a clear message that violations of the law would not be tolerated. While brutal by modern standards, these measures reflected the harsh realities of frontier life, where conventional institutions for rehabilitation or incarceration were absent. Sheriffs also had to contend with the moral ambiguity inherent in frontier justice. Unlike in organized urban centers, where legal codes were extensive and formalized, the law on the frontier was often fluid and situational. Sheriffs made judgment calls based on immediate circumstances, community norms, and practical considerations. This flexibility could lead to injustice, but it also allowed sheriffs to respond effectively to threats and maintain social cohesion in a volatile environment. The line between right and wrong was rarely clear, cut, and sheriffs were constantly challenged to interpret and enforce laws in a way that preserved both justice and order. The enforcement of justice extended beyond criminal activity to include social regulation. Sheriffs maintained order in saloons, regulated gambling, and sometimes intervened in disputes arising from alcohol-fueled brawls. They monitored the movement of transient populations, including miners, cowboys, and travelers, whose presence could introduce unpredictability and risk into the community. Sheriffs also played a role in mediating conflicts between settlers and Native American tribes, navigating complex cultural dynamics and legal ambiguities. In many ways, the sheriff served as a social stabilizer, maintaining the delicate balance between individual freedom and communal safety. Violent confrontations were an ever-present aspect of frontier justice. While gunfights were less common than popular culture suggests, sheriffs had to be prepared for lethal encounters at any moment. Outlaws were often well-armed, experienced in tactics, and willing to use violence to achieve their goals. Sheriffs needed to anticipate these threats, plan strategies, and position themselves and their deputies effectively. Successful law enforcement required a combination of marksmanship, tactical thinking, and psychological insight. The ability to de-escalate conflicts or project authority without immediate violence was often as important as the capacity to engage in armed confrontation. Sheriffs were also deeply involved in the pursuit of fugitives. Tracking and apprehending criminals required knowledge of the terrain, endurance, and resourcefulness. Frontier fugitives could disappear across mountains, deserts, and rivers, taking advantage of the isolation and vastness of the landscape. Sheriffs relied on informants, local guides, and careful observation to locate suspects, often coordinating with neighboring towns or territorial authorities. These pursuits tested the physical and mental limits of lawmen, demanding determination, resilience, and strategic thinking. Corruption and political pressures were constant challenges in frontier justice. Sheriffs were elected or appointed, and their positions often depended on local political alliances. They had to navigate competing interests, maintain public support, and resist the influence of powerful individuals or factions seeking preferential treatment. Bribes, intimidation, and personal vendettas threatened to undermine the impartial administration of justice. The most effective sheriffs maintained integrity, exercised discretion, and cultivated credibility through consistent, fair, and courageous action. Their reputation was their most valuable asset, both as a deterrent to crime and as a foundation for the legitimacy of their authority. Despite the hardships, sheriffs often developed a profound understanding of human behavior. They recognized patterns of criminal activity, identified potential threats, and anticipated conflicts before they erupted. This psychological insight allowed them to act decisively and maintain order in environments where traditional legal structures were limited. Sheriffs who combined courage, intelligence, and empathy could prevent violence, resolve disputes, and sustain the fragile stability of their communities. Their success depended on a holistic approach to law enforcement, integrating physical preparedness, strategic thinking, and social understanding. The legacy of frontier justice is both fascinating and complex. It shaped the mythology of the American West, inspiring legends of courageous sheriffs, daring pursuits, and high-stakes confrontations. Yet the reality was grounded in the daily work of maintaining order, mediating disputes, and navigating moral ambiguity. The sheriff's role was multidimensional, encompassing enforcement, leadership, diplomacy, and community stewardship. Their actions were guided by practical necessity, moral judgment, and a commitment to protecting life and property in a world defined by uncertainty and danger. In conclusion, justice on the edge of civilization was a delicate, demanding, and sometimes dangerous enterprise. Sheriffs operated in a world where law and order were fragile, human behavior was unpredictable, and the consequences of failure were immediate and severe. Their daily work required courage, intelligence, judgment, and resilience. They enforced the law, mediated disputes, protected communities, and navigated the moral complexities of frontier life. The sheriff's badge was not only a symbol of authority, it was a testament to the responsibility, skill, and courage required to maintain justice in a land defined by freedom, danger, and opportunity. In the hands of capable sheriffs, justice became a stabilizing force, shaping communities, preserving social order, and leaving a lasting legacy in the history and mythology of the American West. The American West has long been immortalized in stories of rugged landscapes, violent confrontations, and legendary figures who stood as symbols of courage and justice. Among these figures, sheriffs and lawmen became larger-than-life personalities, their deeds transforming ordinary frontier towns into stages for drama, heroism, and sometimes tragedy. While many sheriffs worked quietly, maintaining order in dusty streets without fanfare, a select few achieved fame that transcended the boundaries of their towns, leaving an indelible mark on the mythology of the Wild West. Their lives illustrate not only the dangers and challenges of frontier law enforcement, but also the complex blend of courage, cunning, and luck required to succeed in such a volatile environment. One of the most iconic figures of the frontier was wyattearp, whose name has become synonymous with law and legend. Born in 1848 in Illinois, Earp moved west in search of opportunity, eventually becoming a lawman in Dodge City, Kansas, and later in Tombstone, Arizona. Earp's life exemplified the perils, responsibilities, and moral ambiguities of frontier justice. He served as a sheriff, deputy, and federal lawman, confronting outlaws, gambling disputes, and violent feuds with a combination of courage, strategic thinking, and resilience. Perhaps his most famous moment came during the gunfight at the O.K. Corral in 1881, a confrontation that has been immortalized in countless films, books, and documentaries. Yet Earp's fame did not stem solely from this shootout. It arose from decades of navigating the complexities of frontier life, balancing the enforcement of law with the practical realities of survival, reputation, and negotiation. Another legendary lawman was Bat Masterson, a contemporary of Earp who carved his reputation in Dodge City, Kansas. Masterson's career exemplified the adaptability required of frontier sheriffs. He served as a deputy, sheriff, and later a sports writer in New York, demonstrating versatility in both law enforcement and personal enterprise. Masterson was known for his sharp intelligence, marksmanship, and diplomatic skills, which allowed him to manage complex situations in towns rife with conflict, gambling, and gunfights. Like other frontier lawmen, his effectiveness depended as much on strategy, reputation, and psychological insight as on physical prowess. Masterson's life illustrates how lawmen operated in a world where authority was fragile, community cooperation was essential, and public perception could determine success or failure. Pat Garrett is another figure whose name is inseparable from the legend of the American West. Born in 1850, Garrett became a sheriff in Lincoln County, New Mexico, where he is best remembered for pursuing and ultimately killing the notorious outlaw Billy the Kid. Garrett's story demonstrates the extreme challenges faced by sheriffs in tracking fugitives across vast, rugged terrain. The pursuit required meticulous planning, knowledge of geography, and the ability to anticipate the outlaws' movements. Garrett's success in apprehending Billy the Kid illustrates the blend of persistence, courage, and tactical skill necessary for law enforcement in a landscape where isolation, danger, and lawlessness were constants. Yet his story also reflects the moral complexities of frontier justice. Decisions often carried life or death consequences, and the line between lawman and executioner was sometimes blurred. Wild Bill Hickok is another figure whose life embodies the peril, skill, and mythology of frontier law enforcement. Born James Butler Hickok in 1837, he earned fame as a scout, lawman, and gunfighter, operating in towns such as Abilene and Deadwood. Hickok's reputation was built on his prowess with firearms, his strategic thinking, and his fearless approach to confronting outlaws. However, Hickok's life also highlights the thin line between survival and demise in the West. He faced constant threats, endured betrayals, and ultimately met a violent death, shot while playing poker in Deadwood. His story underscores the reality that fame and skill offered no guarantee of safety on the frontier, and that even the most celebrated lawmen were vulnerable in a world defined by unpredictability and violence. These famous lawmen shared characteristics that were essential for survival and success on the frontier. Courage was paramount, but it was not enough on its own. They needed judgment, strategy, and an understanding of human behavior. Reputation was as powerful a tool as any weapon, influencing the behavior of townspeople, deputies, and outlaws alike. A well-regarded sheriff could prevent conflicts before they erupted, deter crime through presence and perception, and maintain authority without constant reliance on violence. Conversely, a sheriff whose reputation was weak or inconsistent faced constant challenges, as authority without respect often provoked resistance or outright rebellion. The daily lives of these lawmen were filled with both ordinary duties and extraordinary crises. Beyond famous shootouts and pursuits, they dealt with disputes over land, water, livestock, gambling, and business claims. They patrolled streets and surrounding territories, managed jails, and coordinated with deputies or volunteer posses. They mediated feuds, negotiated truces, and often intervened in conflicts that had the potential to escalate into deadly violence. Their ability to balance enforcement, diplomacy, and strategy defined their effectiveness and often determined the survival of their communities. The notoriety of famous sheriffs also shaped the broader cultural perception of the West. Newspapers, dime novels, and later films celebrated their deeds, sometimes exaggerating their heroism or dramatizing their confrontations. While myth and reality were intertwined, these stories inspired generations, reinforcing the archetype of the courageous, principled lawman standing against lawlessness. The fame of figures like Earp, Masterson, Garrett, and Hickok extended beyond their towns, influencing perceptions of justice, morality, and heroism in a rapidly expanding nation. Yet the lives of famous lawmen were not purely glamorous. They were fraught with danger, uncertainty, and moral complexity. Decisions often carried profound consequences for themselves, their deputies, and the community. A single misjudgment could result in injury, death, or the loss of public trust. The psychological burden was immense, compounded by isolation, long hours, and exposure to human suffering and violence. Fame offered recognition, but it did not shield lawmen from the harsh realities of frontier life. Many died young, victims of gunfire, ambushes, or the relentless hazards of the environment. Others lived with the lasting impact of violence, stress, and difficult moral choices. The fame of these lawmen also influenced the recruitment, training, and expectations of future sheriffs. Their stories became templates for courage, skill, and leadership, setting standards for what it meant to enforce law on the frontier. Young men aspiring to positions of authority studied their tactics, strategies, and decisions, learning from both their successes and their failures. The mythologizing of famous sheriffs reinforced values such as bravery, integrity, and decisiveness, embedding them into the cultural consciousness of the West. Importantly, these lawmen also highlight the diversity of skills required for frontier justice. Physical prowess, marksmanship, and endurance were essential, but so were intelligence, diplomacy, and psychological insight. They had to read people, anticipate conflicts, and navigate social dynamics with skill and tact. They balanced immediate enforcement with long-term strategy, recognizing that the stability of a town depended on more than punitive measures. It required leadership, negotiation, and the ability to inspire respect and cooperation. The legacies of these figures endure not merely because of their fame, but because of the impact they had on the communities they served. They brought order to chaotic environments, protected citizens from harm, and established norms for justice and authority in a rapidly changing landscape. Their lives illustrate the broader realities of frontier law enforcement: the constant danger, the moral ambiguity, the reliance on skill and judgment, and the necessity of courage in the face of uncertainty. In summary, the famous lawmen of the West were more than legendary figures. They were complex individuals navigating an environment defined by danger, lawlessness, and opportunity. Wyatt Bat Masterson, Pat Garrett, and Wildbill Hickok exemplify the courage, strategy, and resilience required to maintain order on the frontier. Their stories illuminate the challenges and responsibilities of law enforcement in a land where authority was fragile, conflicts were immediate, and survival depended on skill, judgment, and reputation. Through their deeds, both real and mythologized, they shaped the mythology of the Wild West, leaving an enduring legacy of courage, justice, and the relentless pursuit of order in a lawless world. The figure of the Western sheriff occupies a singular place in American history and culture. More than just a lawman, the sheriff symbolized the fragile establishment of order in a vast, often chaotic frontier. The era of the Wild West is now long past, but its lessons, myths, and legacies continue to shape our understanding of courage, justice, and leadership. The sheriff of the 19th century frontier was a man, or occasionally a woman, who stood as the intermediary between civilization and chaos, whose presence alone could stabilize a community teetering on the edge of anarchy. Understanding the legacy of these figures allows us to appreciate both the practical realities of frontier life and the enduring mythology that their lives inspired. The most immediate legacy of Western sheriffs was the establishment of law and order in regions that had previously been governed by force, negotiation, or personal vendettas. Many towns on the frontier began as mining camps, trading posts, or temporary settlements, with little to no formal governance. Disputes over land, water, and property were frequent, and criminal activity could go unchecked. Sheriffs, often elected by local communities, were tasked with imposing a measure of authority and ensuring that disputes were resolved within a framework of justice, however rudimentary. Their ability to enforce laws, mediate conflicts, and deter criminal behavior laid the groundwork for the transition from lawless frontier settlements to organized towns and eventually established cities. In addition to their immediate law enforcement role, sheriffs contributed to the social cohesion of frontier communities. Their presence symbolized protection, stability, and accountability. The sheriff's office became a central institution around which towns could organize themselves. They mediated disputes not just between criminals and victims, but also among ordinary citizens, balancing interests in a way that maintained harmony and minimized bloodshed. In a society where violence was always a possibility, the sheriff acted as both a deterrent and a moral arbiter, demonstrating that even in a land of freedom, there could exist rules, consequences, and justice. The stories of individual sheriffs also contributed to the larger cultural memory of the American West. Figures such as Wyatt Bat Masterson, Pat Garrett, and Wild Bill Hickok transcended their immediate communities, becoming legends through newspapers, dime novels, and later films and television. Their exploits, whether real, exaggerated, or mythologized, helped define the archetype of the Western lawman, courageous, decisive, and morally upright, standing against lawlessness with skill and determination. These narratives served not only to entertain, but also to provide models of behavior, illustrating ideals of bravery, integrity, and leadership under extreme conditions. The mythos surrounding Western sheriffs also shaped the perception of American identity. The frontier sheriff came to represent the values of independence, self-reliance, and justice, tempered by courage and intelligence. In popular culture, this figure often embodies the tension between freedom and order, demonstrating that authority can coexist with individual liberty when exercised responsibly. These stories reinforce the notion that the American West was a testing ground for character, morality, and societal structures, a place where individuals could distinguish themselves not only through physical skill, but through judgment, courage, and resilience. Beyond cultural mythology, the legacy of frontier sheriffs had practical implications for the development of law enforcement in the United States. Their experiences informed the establishment of more formal policing structures in newly settled territories and eventually in growing cities. Lessons learned in tracking fugitives, mediating disputes, and maintaining order in isolated communities influenced training, strategies, and organizational practices in later law enforcement agencies. The frontier sheriff can be seen as a precursor to modern policing, embodying principles of accountability, adaptability, and community engagement in environments where institutional support was minimal. Sheriffs also left a legacy in terms of governance and civic responsibility. Elected or appointed by the local populace, they demonstrated the importance of public trust, reputation, and leadership in maintaining social order. Their effectiveness relied not solely on force, but on the respect they commanded and the moral authority they exercised. This dynamic highlighted the interplay between power, responsibility, and community consent, a principle that remains relevant in modern discussions of governance and law enforcement. The risks faced by sheriffs further underscore their enduring legacy. They confronted armed outlaws, managed feuds, and navigated a landscape of moral ambiguity, all while maintaining the trust of their communities. Their courage and resilience became touchstones for narratives about heroism and leadership. While many sheriffs died young or suffered personal tragedy, their perseverance in the face of danger exemplified qualities that would be celebrated for generations: bravery, judgment, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The physical and symbolic tools of the sheriff, firearms, badges, horses, and offices, remain iconic representations of this legacy. They were not merely instruments of law enforcement. They were extensions of authority, presence, and competence. A well-maintained revolver, a steady horse, and a visible badge projected strength, deterring potential lawbreakers and reassuring citizens. These tangible elements, combined with the sheriff's judgment, reputation, and strategy, created a comprehensive framework for maintaining order in an environment defined by unpredictability and risk. Another enduring element of the sheriff's legacy is the ethical and moral dimension of frontier justice. Sheriffs often operated in a world without standardized laws, formal courts, or structured legal procedures. They were tasked with making decisions that could affect life, death, and the cohesion of their communities. The responsibility to act with fairness, integrity, and discernment under these conditions set a standard for ethical conduct in situations of high uncertainty and danger. The ethical dilemmas faced by sheriffs, deciding when to use force, how to mediate disputes, and how to balance community needs with individual rights, offer valuable lessons in leadership and moral reasoning that extend beyond the frontier. The legend of the Western sheriff also influenced literature, cinema, and popular culture. Stories of courageous lawmen confronting outlaws in dusty streets became foundational narratives in American storytelling. Films and novels perpetuated the image of the sheriff as a moral and physical hero, emphasizing traits such as courage, decisiveness, and fairness. These portrayals, while sometimes exaggerated, reinforced the cultural perception of the sheriff as a symbol of justice in a turbulent world. They also contributed to the romanticization of the frontier, shaping how subsequent generations understood the challenges and opportunities of the American West. Furthermore, the Western sheriff's legacy persists in modern law enforcement, symbolism, and ethos. The emphasis on community engagement, rapid response, adaptability, and moral authority can be traced back to the practices and experiences of frontier sheriffs. The lessons they learned in managing isolated, unpredictable, and high-risk environments continue to inform strategies for policing in rural, frontier, or high-crime areas. In this sense, the sheriff's influence extends beyond folklore, contributing to the practical development of law enforcement principles in contemporary society. Importantly, the legacy of the Western sheriff is not limited to tales of gunfights and daring pursuits. It encompasses the quiet, persistent work of maintaining order, mediating disputes, and building community stability. Many sheriffs achieved remarkable feats not through dramatic confrontations, but through the steady exercise of judgment, authority, and diplomacy. Their daily efforts to ensure justice, protect citizens, and sustain social cohesion reflect a broader understanding of leadership, one that values foresight, restraint, and ethical decision-making alongside courage and action. The enduring fascination with Western sheriffs also reflects our collective appreciation for resilience, bravery, and the human capacity to impose order in challenging circumstances. These figures operated on the edge of civilization, where the consequences of action or inaction were immediate and profound. Their ability to navigate danger, complexity, and moral ambiguity provides a compelling narrative of human courage and ingenuity. In celebrating their stories, we recognize the enduring importance of leadership, responsibility, and justice in the face of uncertainty. In conclusion, the legacy of the Western sheriff is both practical and symbolic. They shaped the course of frontier towns, contributed to the development of law enforcement, and inspired enduring cultural narratives. Their lives demonstrate the interplay of courage, skill, judgment, and moral authority in environments defined by lawlessness, danger, and opportunity. The sheriff's badge symbolizes more than authority. It represents responsibility, resilience, and the human effort to impose justice in a chaotic world. As both historical figures and cultural icons, Western sheriffs continue to captivate our imagination, offering lessons in leadership, ethics, and perseverance that remain relevant today. This was life for a Wild West sheriff, if dangerous, lonely, and legendary. A reminder that even in the wildest corners of history, someone had to keep the peace.